Good afternoon. Welcome. Glad to meet you all. See some of you again. What an amazing conference it's been so far. Thank you, Laura. And XR Studios is a great facility, isn't it? So before I dive in, I'll remind you what a zoetrope is. First built around the 1860s, zoetropes are experiments in moving pictures. They use an inward-facing disc of pictures, revealed to the eye by slits, rotating on the opposite side from the images, to create an animated image that looks like it's moving. It's a fun little exploration into persistence of vision that helped bring us to the point we're at today. So, do the two shows I'm talking about today use that literal mechanism? No, they do not. If you feel cheated by that, I understand. This presentation would have been even cooler if I were describing massive steel sheets spinning around the audience at unimaginably fast speeds. Anyway, sorry. Note, the events I'm talking about today both had a ring of screens that suggested to me being inside a zoetrope. And I think being surrounded by imagery, even if they're not spinning at hundreds of feet per second, really unlocks an extra level of immersion for the audience. I would put it this way. So I'm not going to focus on this. I'm interested in the technical problems that this presents more than why it works to capture people and attention. And especially how to solve it without just making the screens bigger, because, well, budget. So I'm going to do what I suspect I'm known for. I'm going to get too technical too quickly. But first, I'm going to tell you about how I got here, and in a second, I'll tell you how to find out more. I started as a video technician in the UK, sort of by accident. I think lots of people find their way in live events by accident. There's no recruiting offices that I've ever seen. And my move towards big events came when I started to deal with big video projection. And these are light valve projectors at the time. And oddly, that involved a lot of video engineering, because back then, that was the only way to do something as simple as cross-fading between two video inputs. And more to the point, that's where I found an excellent mentor, Tim Volker. He held scant regard for what others thought difficult or impossible, and was endlessly curious and inventive. And, well, patient, I'd say, with the benefit of hindsight. And it helped that I've always been endlessly curious. So in the freelance years after that, I dabbled into video wall programming, found I had some kind of knack for it. Around that time, I did some rock and roll, and I also moved to the US. I live in the Bay Area. I did many, many years of show control programming, generally related to video screens, since video companies were my clients. And I did my time project managing video crews. And spoiler alert, they're actually kind of difficult. So I taught myself C++, since basic tools weren't getting me there. And I was able to build some applications, then a media server, spent some time selling those in between shows. And I did hundreds of shows switching screens, Spider, Encore, etc. High-res engineering, we called it at first. I was also teaching and mentoring other techs as much as I could along the way. Then I decided I need more room to play, so I pivoted to creative technology. And daunted by the sheer number of software applications I would have to master, with all the Adobe Suite 3D modeling effects, I decided to focus energy on Touch Designer, one app to rule them all. I'm going to talk about Touch Designer later, and I'm pleased to see it being featured in other talks. It's got a steep learning curve, but it can do most anything. Then after a while, we started to use disguised media servers for scalability, so we could sub-rent gear, so we could find talented programmers. Then, during the pandemic, where everyone else learned to bake bread, instead, I learned to make full-stack web applications. So, any bakers in the room? Okay, you win. And now I'm working as a problem-solving creative technologist. And a new adventure, I'm hosting a podcast, Backstage Wizards. The focus is on our underdocumented industry, how people have solved interesting problems on shows, and what stories and adventures they had along the way. We're soft launching today with an episode featuring Framework's own Laura Frank online. And she took time out of organizing this conference to share some amazing knowledge with me. We have an episode with Matt Ward, who you'll hear about in a moment, coming next week. Please check it out later. So let's get into the two Inside the Zoetrope shows. I was the lead programmer for a very interesting trade show booth for Turner, the TV network, in the late 90s. We faced a lot of challenges, and we delivered a result that baffled our peers. Maybe it does to this day. So consider, if you were asked to feed 65 independent video screens, What would that lift be like in your workflow? Then the BMW NEC is a regular annual show for Storyteller. And that show gets creative extras in return for the client having a lot of imagination and trust and cool cars. So I'm going to talk about the shows, what was similar, what was different, and how we solved problems in different ways based on the tools we had 25 years apart. And hopefully, you'll be able to see how the journey and the challenges along the way have led me to a creative problem-solving approach I use now. So, BMW After Sales, it's an annual conference for the brand to communicate with and celebrate their dealers and service managers. Lisa Sato was the creative director, Sullivan Taylor was the production designer, and they're both from Storyteller, a Bay Area creative production agency where I also work as the CTO. Here's what we had. We had a 6-meter by 3.5 meter screen with 1.5 mil row LED Helios processing. We had two 3-meter by 3-meter side screens of 1.5 mil LED. Then here's the interesting part. We have 36 free-hanging panels of Vanish 8 mil LED, and that's a transparent LED product if you haven't run into it. But then also we had 24 mirror panels suspended in line with the LED screens. Lisa Sato, the creative director, explained, the party, the design essence, for BMW NEC 23 was the idea of reflection and expanding space, representing the BMW teams, who they are now, and who they are becoming, game changers. Game changers is one of the main themes, and this theme led to the use of photographs you'll see in a moment. Then Sullivan Taylor, the production designer, said, to fulfill our party for BMW NEC, the integration of mirrors into the production design was essential. The row of mirror panels, despite being in a straight line, completed the circle of Vanish LED panels visually. Let's see how that looked. I think it was pretty cool. So let's move on to the Turner booth. The Turner Networks booth in Atlanta in the late 90s had a very ambitious video system that our company inherited, I guess, when some other vendors dipped out, since it was an ambitious ask. Matt Ward, who's here today, was head of video wall at AVTS, and due to the programming needs and his reputation for delivering where others could not, this fell into his wheelhouse. And he was assisted in the decision to take on the project by his Dark Lord. At least that has long been my assumption, and Matt has never denied it. We put our heads together recently, and to the best of our recollections, this is what we were dealing with. We had a center 3x3 projection video wall. We were using Toshiba cubes at the time. We had 32 TVs in a row above the audience on the right, 6 speakers in with those, 32 TVs in a row above the audience area on the left, and 6 speakers. And the main ask was a cool ticker tape scroll effect across the TVs. So Matt points out they wanted that effect, and we had to back into that from a technical point of view in order to figure out how it was remotely possible. And his collaborator, Cthulhu, noted, the taste of souls in anguish during pre-programming was exquisite. I feel like I owe Matt for that. We don't have any documentation, sadly, but I tried to recreate it for you. Here's how it may have looked. And here's what we had to play with. So if you took some time, you might be able to work out that the numbers don't add up. For instance, the video wall processor with 16 outputs can't feed 64 screens. And obviously 5 video players can't feed 64 screens. So how do we do it? Well, it's not simple. I'm going to try and describe it. So let's start. You can call it cheating if you want, by feeding all the screens on the left with the reverse routing of the screens on the right. So luckily, a broadcast router usually had 2 output connectors per router output. Not to get too far in the engineering, but we were dealing with composite standard definition video at the time, interlaced 4 ADI. Each DREMI DDR held all the videos and letters as stills. My best recollection is that one deck played videos and output audio, and the other 4 just delivered stills. And I suppose, knowing what we know now, we could have just rasterized an entire font and symbols onto video, but it was quicker for us where every single frame would need to be picked out in a queue to get the letters we needed in order, a few frames for every letter. So we'd start a video playing on one DDR with a tracks queue and route it to all the screens. So note, we could cleanly switch between signals, and something that's oddly difficult to do today. That's because all the sources were gen-locked and identical, and the broadcast router, made by Pacer, supported a vertical interval switch, meaning it switched invisibly in the gap between video frames. Having clean routing in a system breaks the lock between the quantity of processing and the quantity of outputs, which is still a valid goal. We did all the control with Dayton Tracks. You may have heard of Watchout, their media server app. Tracks running on an old trackball Mac laptop, state-of-the-art at the time, sent queues to devices on serial connections via a device called a smart PAX. Part of our task was creating drivers to do reliable serial control of every device we needed, and creating serial cables with the exact wiring needed to communicate. No IP addresses on site. Let's move to video wall processor. So, we know it didn't have enough outputs to feed all of our screens, but what it could do was programmed freezing of any of the 16 outputs it did have. And that was Matt's crazy idea. That was one of Matt's crazy ideas. All right, that was one in a frankly frightening series of crazy ideas. So feeding the DDRs into the video wall processor, then the video wall processor into the composite router was the secret sauce. We loaded 4 letters into 4 of the DDRs, and then unfroze 4 outputs on the video wall processor, routed to them, and then we froze them again. Note, none of this is visible to the audience because all these outputs aren't routed anywhere. Then we repeated the cycle with the next 4 letters and the next 4 video wall outputs, and so on. Until we had 15 letters spelling out the words, a toner channel, plus a still we wanted to leave behind the letters. Remember that in the world of video routing, as opposed to generating content, you have to send an output to each screen. There's no black, there's no nothing. You've got to feed something. So maybe you can imagine where this is going. We routed each letter in turn to each screen, then started one screen from the left, and routed them all again, and so on, and so on. Decided not to make this too much torture by not showing all 32 outputs. Okay, so let's see that again in context. So here's Matt and me, happy the plan worked out. We don't have any pictures from that era, but I am pretty sure this is close to how we looked. So all it took now was a hanging garden of queues, Pacer router queues and tracks. A single move to spin the letters across the screens was 900 individual queues in the tracks timeline. If we wanted to change the timing, and oh, we changed the timing so many times, we needed to move 899 of those queues by just a few fractions of a second. But what we found out, if we routed as fast as we wanted, more speed being a smoother animation and a higher frame rate, the router's processor would crash. So we spent a few days just finding out how slow we needed to go reliably not to crash the router. We wanted to walk right up to the line, obviously, as I'm sure you would. I don't have access to tracks or the show files anymore. I don't even own a floppy drive. But for reference, here's the cue system duplicated in Touch Designer, just so you can see the quantity. And this doesn't express the timing, really, just the routing. The tracks queues were more complex. Each tracks queue had a specified destination and a source for every route, and then we had to execute each animation step as a router salvo. We used overlapping audio fade cues to pan sounds across the speakers to get a feeling of movement in sync with the images as well. Really enhanced the effect. And at the time, audio spatialization was a bit of a dark art. I sometimes think the hardest part was convincing my horrified audio friends that I didn't want a mixer with 16 inputs and 4 outputs. I wanted a mixer with 4 inputs and 16 outputs. There was a lot more to the adventures in timing. If you remember the images we had to grab as video stills, well, as you can imagine, we want to do that quickly too. And that was key to how quickly we could get between different lines of text. The load, unfreeze, freeze cycle was another delicate dance of timing, complicated by bugs and quirks in the DDRs and drivers that caused occasional corruption, explaining why some of us refer to the show as Tartan Neo work. Yeah, that was another adventure and tests of fixes and incredibly fine timing tweaks, because much as it amused us, we had a feeling it wouldn't amuse the network as much. And Matt just reminded me the other day that occasional letters would still sneak through, but we just had to risk it. Okay, so that was it, the AV mystery of the 90s. Unfortunately, now you all know how it was done. We do have some cleanup. If you could look at the screen, please. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm glad to meet you all. What an amazing conference it's been so far. XR Studios is a great facility, isn't it? So the queues for Turner could be regarded as one long timeline. Tracks had a frankly excellent timeline that I'd be happy to have access to on shows these days. But there wasn't great scope for modularity. The closest thing to a variable was to use a fake device at the time. And the timeline looked a lot like a grapevine by the time we're finished. This long span with huge clusters of queues hanging off it. We had to be sure that the big block of movement queues was just right before we copied it so many hundreds of times. If I had the tools I have now, it would have been a lot more efficient. Recreating these effects to show you how it worked was much, much quicker. Although Chris, who helped me make the slides, maybe wouldn't agree, but I wouldn't have passed up the learning experience for anything. And I know Matt and Cthulhu also got a lot out of it. All right, well, let's see how we faced some similar challenges in a modern setting with modern tools 25 years later. So in general, we're now in the age of the monoliths. We have very capable, high-cost systems that can do everything in one system with few boxes, fully mature media servers. Scalability now means just make sure you have enough outputs, since every output can do almost anything you need. Of course, if your system doesn't do exactly what you need, it's not like you can use 2 different monoliths within a reasonable budget. We do still have some modularity in the system. An LED processor can act like a video wall processor, taking a defined chunk of pixels, distributing them evenly across panels. At BMW, that was step 1. We defined a 6x6 grid and shared that with the LED team for addressing. 36 row vanish panels were hung in an arc over the audience facing the stage. And since they're low resolution with an 8mm pixel pitch, each panel is only 112 by 112 square, we were dealing with one signal output, even handling all 36 screens together. So we used Disguise to feed all the main screens at BMW via a Barco E2. So we decided to just also feed the Vanish panels from Disguise. That meant we could run the opening experience as one-time video and switch cleanly on cues in the Disguise timeline. In the innovative BMW design, remember the mirrors? They were carefully positioned in orientation to the Vanish panels, so the audience perceived a complete circle of screens. Some of the audience were behind the Vanish panels, so they only saw the reflection of the panels. But since the entrance was from behind the main screen, they were all inside the Zoetrope from the start. Well, let's look at a piece I called the Carousel. It was a photo montage of the attendees, some of whom had come directly from having their photo taken just 5 minutes before on a floor below. And the carousel played during walk-in, and it was featured again during the opening experience. And it was key to helping the audience feel that they were the game changers. And apart from dynamic access to pictures taken moments before, the creative called for the ratio of images to blank space and the change speed to be varying as the walk-in progressed, building to the screens being completely filled with pictures and changing rapidly. And that all meant a fixed, programmed, 30-minute-long timeline wasn't a great choice. I mean, consider the challenges on Turner of having so many cues almost identical and then trying to change them. So instead, we decided to feed a generative system into disguise via NDI, a network video protocol. I feel like everyone knows what NDI is at this point, but using NDI, instead of switching in the E2, for instance, meant that the media server timeline had control of when the generative graphics would be visible. And we used the exact same grid layout for the NDI, so we didn't have to make complex mappings in the media server. Well, the generative system that we go to first is Touch Designer, a visual programming system. There are powerful alternatives. We know what we can do with Touch. Most of our projects involve Touch Designer in some way. It's also nice to be able to scale, work on your own laptops when you're building. We'll run Touch Designer on tiny NUCs, and then also on server-grade PCs with Quadro GPUs and SDI cards. All right, let's get technical again. Ready? Yeah, visual doesn't mean simple. Touch Designer has a really nice replicator system. It means you can define a complex system inside a component, as if you're wiring a complex video and control system, much like we did for Turner, in a way, and then replicate or clone that a number of times based on other parameters. Each copy will change live as you tweak the master, and you can feed unique parameters into each, for instance, to have them linked to a specific item in a list of images. For the carousel, we decided, focusing on just one screen here, that we would feed in a file path or a blank string to represent black, and when it changed, have the component automatically fade down, change image, and then fade back up. There was, again, a little piece of timing to that, ironically similar to the timing challenges in Turner. Touch Designer has chops, or channel operators. These are Touch Designer's nodes that handle numeric values that can generate a curved pulse channel, and we can then apply logic to take actions when the pulse touched 0. And wiring the pulse channel to a dissolve to black made a nice dip through black. When it hit full black, we switched out the image by unfreeze and freeze, just like on Turner. Then fade it up to the new image, or to black if we were removing the image. And we also use tops, or texture operators. Touch Designer's nodes that process video to crop the photos to square, do some color tweaks, make the images black and white, make the black background disappear, and then do a high-quality downscale to the limited LED resolution. Then each clone did the exact same job, but triggered by its own row in a table. For deciding what went on each screen, what was in each table row, we had the choice to use a complex setup of visual logic, or to use the tight integration with Python in Touch Designer. We could have used pure Python, but mixing visual programming and code is a huge boost in development. The visual representation of tables and text fields and waveforms becomes a powerful visualization into what your code and the system are doing. Literally seeing table rows change versus trusting they'll change the way you hope, seeing versus imagining, that's a game changer. So the Python code triggering from a timer that we could vary and control looked at the tables that had a row for every vanished LED panel. The code picked a blank row and then picked an image from a watch Dropbox folder in another table and cross-referenced against the images already visible on screen to avoid duplication. Essentially, filling and clearing rows in those tables was the driving mechanism for the entire piece. You can see that we broke the sections into batches, since the fullness looked better when we handled it in one section of the panels at a time. Pseudo-randomness is a deceptively complex problem in coding, and getting live insight as we created it was gold. And just like Turner, we broke the task down and dealt with it step by step, then put the results back together. The actual live updating of the images from the on-site photographer didn't feel like a significant challenge, since I worked on so many Facebook interactives doing social media scraping, for instance here where Facebook Messenger added support for images and GIFs. So Dropbox can push images around, Touch Designer can detect files changing in a folder, boom, done. Well, now we had 36 cloned Touch Designer components, each of which making an image the exact pixel size we need. Replicators do have a script function that we could have used to programmatically wire up the outputs, but it's simpler to use select tops that can pull the image from the corresponding panel component based on a simple expression using the digits at the end of their name, and then you can wire that all into a set of grids. And voila, we have a grid that matches our defined LED raster, and we can output that on LED, on an NDI, to receive in the media servers. And that was the carousel. As a side note, when dealing with many screens or very big screens, negative space becomes this topic. There's a pushback against using it fully in corporate. Many people can't shift the black is wrong, black's a mistake mentality. But transparent products work best if you embrace it. Black is invisible, not a black screen. And the other screens just become more important. Our creative director and production designer understood this, and then they took the client into VR to show them why negative space works. And as you've seen, we also used that with the photographs, with some extra processing, to make the frames of the panels disappear. The audience was seeing floating headshots, not square screens. Another piece related to what was on the panels during the many hours of corporate presentation. Black? Eh. Some sort of still? Eh. What we decided to do is take a feed from the live slide presentation and process it to derive an interesting, but not distracting, image that the audience would see mainly on the mirrors around the LED screens. We call this the bokeh effect, after the Japanese word for blur or haze. Again, Touch Designer's replicator was key. We fed an SDI signal from the E2 into the Touch Designer server, cropped a piece of the image, and applied transforms and blur until it suggested the current slide, but didn't have any visible text or branding that we shouldn't contort. And Touch Designer's experimental and modular nature was critical. We could show 10 different looks to the creative director in 10 minutes, so she could flick through slides and help us find the look she wanted. For control, we bypassed the need for control by just feeding the bokeh as a separate signal to be used anytime we wanted. And we also used the panel during the NEC party to create an amazing neon garden of VJ-style visuals. We also made a nice virtual spray can graffiti system with the side screens. You can look out for a podcast episode covering that. So BMW NEC 23 was a huge hit with the audience and the client. Storyteller was able to immerse the audience in images without a painful expense in huge screens and huge pixel spaces to handle. From my point of view, splitting the media server programming from the generative pieces meant that we never held up rehearsals. So, 25 years apart. Similar effects for the audience, very different approaches. And I actually enjoyed putting this presentation together, and it made me think about the way I used to approach things versus the way I approach things now. Back then, we didn't even have all the choices we have now. Probably were only a few ways of accomplishing toner. I'm lucky that Matt and I found one of the ways, and we were willing and able to push through and make it happen. Well, my process looks a bit more like this now. Research, really understand the problem. Research tools that might help me solve the problem. And I can't help hoping every time that I'll find the perfect tool for one system. I never find it. Test with some of the possible tools if I can. Maybe just watch promos or tutorials to see what's possible. Research again. Maybe a hot bath would help. And then more research and research. I tend to research right up to the point where not only is everyone around worried when I'm going to start implementing, but even I'm getting a bit worried about when I'm going to start implementing. This used to bother me until I found a cool study that links it to effective problem solvers, and I'm going with that. However, relationship tip, don't try that on home improvement projects. The more you research, and the more fully you understand the problem, then when you do switch your head to that doing mode, since you understand the problem better, you'll have much more bandwidth to experiment. And that's one of the joys of Touch Designer. The whole time you're building in it, you're also playing, experimenting, and having happy accidents as you go. It's a really fun tool for that. I think one of the other lessons that stuck with me is how to fine-tune, how to dial into the best performance you can get from any given system, and also to give yourself enough time to do that, or for Matt to give you enough time to do that. It's the same thing. Everything I learned from Toner 25 years ago influenced how I problem solve for BMW. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about this. As I say, we're launching a podcast. We just published the initial episode. I think it'll interest you. Please use the QR code, or go to backstagewizards.com, or look for Backstage Wizards in the usual places. There's more coming in the next few weeks. If you drop us a line at hello@storyteller.com, and you'll be the first to know when we have new episodes, or maybe we'll ask you to be a guest. So we have some time for questions. Can I answer anything for anyone? Maybe not you, Matt. As a side note, I can't tell you how much easier it is to be that side of the screen than this side of the screen. That's for sure.
I like introducing this challenge to our community, getting on this side of the screen.
Yeah.
Any questions there?
Thanks, Bruce. For 2023, for BMW, you mentioned that the creative team and production designer had to take the client through a VR experience. Were you still doing your research, and how were you able to help them convey what was or wasn't possible?
Yeah. We use, Storyteller uses Unreal Engine for that. Thank you for the question. Storyteller uses Unreal Engine for that. Luckily, Sully, our production designer, actually has some pretty good Unreal chops. So I think I ducked out of that one. I'll be happy to help you if you have a project. I'll come and do Unreal for your client VR. Yeah. I had the hot bath. That was me. That was all me.
Anyone else?
Hey, Bruce. Hey, wonderful job making Touch Designer not look terrifying. I think you did a great job just giving great examples as to sort of the processes and how you use it. Curious how you sort of approach optimizing your own projects and stuff. Like, do you go through and try to create every option and then reduce back down to normal, or do you like to stay in a very tried and true path in how you want to get? Because I know it's all experimenting, like you said, a lot of happy accidents.
Right.
How do you go about personally just optimizing your own systems?
Yeah, so
Help me reduce.
there is a nice tool in Touch Designer which will show you how much CPU and GPU time each piece is taking. I would say first of all, Touch Designer is incredibly efficient, and I don't know if you're a programmer or if anyone's a programmer here. One of the things they tell you is, don't optimize too early. Don't optimize before you need to. Sometimes just doing things the clearest way. And so I have some fairly deep knowledge of what's going on in a GPU and GPU programming. And so every time I get clever and say, oh, I ought to do it this way, someone else will do it a totally different way in Touch Designer. And that's like a huge facet of Touch Designer, is that there are 8 ways of doing every single task. Someone else will do it some totally other way, and I'll go, well, that can't possibly work. And then I'll check it out, and it's running faster than my code. So I think I wait until there's a problem, and then I try and dig in and solve it. On the whole, with a fast enough machine, I only really get in trouble when we do insane things, like 8
when you're
outputs per
instancing way
machine.
too much and
Yeah. Thank you, though. And thank you for saying I made it trivial. I mean, like I said, Touch Design is learning curve when you first get into it and someone shows it to you. I don't know. I think there's a how to teach people Touch Designer, and the first thing they tell you is get your mouse scroll wheel and just zoom in and out really fast and move the network around really fast, and then, yeah. So I tried not to do that. I think we can release the embargo on Matt asking questions too, just in case.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah, I think why not?
Thanks, Bruce. Couple questions for you. Could you talk a little bit more about how you had a photographer downstairs taking photos of these people. You know, was that uploaded to a server locally that you were hooked into, that the Touch Designer server was hooked into, and you were pulling the images from there? And then was there a reason that you chose to go with the NDI option of getting those textures into your media server as opposed to running like a touch, like the touch engine itself on the media server?
Right. Okay. This is why I don't go shopping. Your first question was, sorry?
No worries. Talking about how you worked with the photographers,
Yeah.
you know, using a local server or
So,
cloud.
yeah, I think, so we were in a hotel. We're in the Aria in Las Vegas. And it's hypothetically possible to get a point-to-point link on a network in a hotel. But it's not wise. So I just use Dropbox. I mean, we use Google Drive just as much for stuff, but I just use Dropbox, and you have like a long conversation with the photographer, and then you have the conversation again because they always forget some parts of it. They had a nice tool which would output their photos. We didn't want them to do the black and white or resize it too much. We wanted Dropbox full of usable pictures. I think we were doing like 2048 by 2048 color, and literally we just picked those up backstage. Luckily it wasn't, I mean, I have done some things on Facebook events where we're trying to do like, dude just scanned his badge, find his picture, you know, and you're trying to do it like extremely fast. This was not one of those cases. We were pretty happy with the fact that they had like gone up an escalator, and we had, Dropbox would get it to us by the time they made it up the escalator. Touch engine. Yeah, I haven't played with this too much, but I actually, going to my point about an appropriate separation, what it meant is that JP, you know, my collaborator was programming the media server, and I was programming Touch Designer. So I didn't really ever have to say like upload a new version or tweak or try and like fight over the machine or anything. I guess if Touch Engine's integration gets good enough that I could, you know, edit and work on it at the same time it's open somewhere else, then maybe I would consider it. But yeah, NDI, and we've done some tests. Sullivan will say different, but I don't personally have much of a problem with the quality on NDI. And what I love is that you get it on the network and you can pick it up anywhere you want. So it's good for that. And we sort of structure our networks with like 3 or 4 different networks there, so that with a lot of work you can keep the heavyweight NDI. Obviously this was 672 by 672, so you wouldn't call it heavyweight. But we had the VJ graphics were running at full resolution. And so we could keep those off on a 10 gig network and not worry about it affecting queues or anything. Sure.
Anyone else? Matt? The floor is yours, man.
I've actually got a question too. Hey, hi.
Hey.
Were you running a backup instance of Touch Designer, and did you have a failover scenario to manage the switching to an alternate NDI feed?
Yeah. So yes, we were running parallel backup servers. Lisa, close your ears. And yeah, I think the backup would have been switching to a different NDI feed in disguise. I think you'd have to ask, I'm going to say this. I expect that JP made a set of duplicate queues. Yeah.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
The solutions you would come up with in the olden days, 25 years ago.
In the old
Are-
days,
The olden days of this world we
Yeah.
live in and work in. Are there some of the solutions, I'm thinking the right words, that were so elegant you find you can't craft modern pathways to achieve the same type of results?
Yeah, that's it. The one that I realized in dealing with this is the routing we could do. So in a modern SDI system, you've probably got a nice broadcast production switcher, and it probably has 10 to 15 outputs. And you can put any of those on an aux bus, and hypothetically, you could attach control to route it. But probably the router in your system, which is probably like 64 by 64 these days, won't be able to do an acceptably clean switch. It couldn't do what we were doing, which is these salvos. course, the pacer router we were doing the salvos on couldn't do the salvos we were trying to do either. But at least when it did it and it managed to not crash, it would do like a clean, cut from the. So I feel like I missed that. Now you have to put E2s and spiders and all these like hyper expensive boxes on things, and it's like this should be easy, So I would say I missed that. I'm not sure. I miss Trax's timeline. I really do. I'm interested in Vertex. Don't tell them.
Anyone else? This is the place to do these things. Okay. Bruce, I'll say thank you very much.
Thanks.
We have a little extra time here. Our next session starts 5 minutes after 3 o'clock. You can spend some personal time with Bruce out in the lobby if you want to ask those more detailed and boring questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bruce.